Good afternoon. I actually want to begin by just taking a moment to appreciate the team that has been putting together this incredible gathering. They are laboring hard behind the scenes. I've just been behind the scenes with some of them, and they often don't get enough credit. So the entire tri-organization team that's put this on, let's give them a round of applause. I also want to give a shout out to our friends from Shakespeare Company, the independent bookstore here in Paris, which has set up shop out on the other side of the lobby. And folks have maybe not noticed them. And I just, as an author, I feel it's my duty to give love to an independent bookstore. So I want to give them a shout out. So my name is Eric Liu. I run a nonprofit organization called Citizen University. And I also run a program out of the Aspen Institute on citizenship and American identity. And all of our work is about citizen power. It is about unlocking the realities of this age that we live in, which is an age of a great push back across continents, across countries and borders, whether you're talking, and across even this moment, to the last several years, from the Tea Party to Occupy Wall Street in the United States, the $15 now minimum wage movement there, Brexit here, the Trump train, the Sanders movement, Black Lives Matter, all of these movements are part of a great pushback against concentrated monopolized power. And I was joking earlier last night with a mayor who shall remain nameless. And when I told this mayor that all my work is about citizen power, the mayor said, is this a good thing? Is it a good thing that citizens all around the world are feeling empowered to topple inherited hierarchies? Is it a good thing that citizens feel like they can just reject the status quo? I say it is. It is net a great thing. It is uncomfortable, it is messy, it is painful. This continent is experiencing it right now. But it is a good thing for cities if you know what to do and how to be changed by it. So the joking, though, about is it a good thing? Are you actually for citizen power? Reveals a couple things that I think we've got to get real about in this room. The first is that the truth of the matter is that citizen action, citizen engagement, citizen participation can often be awfully inconvenient for people who are power brokers, for people who are running cities. It can create a lot of obstacles and a lot more process for folks who'd prefer perhaps a more seamless, efficient, and manageable game. The second reality we've got to get real about is that cities, though we've been celebrating them and championing them throughout the last couple of days, it is also the case that cities today all around the world, and particularly in the United States right now, are monopolizing power and wealth and opportunity. And people who don't live in cities are increasingly resenting those cities. And that's as true of Paris and London as it is of Seattle, where I live. And this experience means that we're going to have to expect more turbulence. That said, I think the reality is today that cities will save democracy if they don't kill it first. Now I want to unpack that statement here. In the book that I've written about citizen power, I describe these three fundamental laws of power and civic life and three imperatives for action that flow from these laws. I just want to give you a quick rundown of them because they frame up a way of thinking about this moment and our responsibility as citizens of cities. Law number one is very simple and very obvious to all of us. Power concentrates. It compounds. Power left to itself tends to yield winner-take-all monopolistic games. Law number two, power justifies itself. At every turn, incumbent holders of power, whether individuals or institutions, will spin elaborate narratives about why it ought to be that way, about why that is the natural order of things, about why you ought to be happy about it. And that's as true of trickle-down economics as it is of white supremacy, narratives of power justifying itself. What saves us from the doom loop of these first two laws, though, in which fewer people are hoarding power and telling everybody else why they ought to be happy about it, what saves us from that doom loop is law number three, which is this: power is infinite. Power is infinite. Now, you may be thinking, who is this Seattle dude coming with this kind of new age sounding line that power is infinite? I'm not talking about just manifesting power, that you can be as wealthy or as influential as you would like to be if you just believe in it. I don't mean that exactly. What I mean is this: it is entirely possible in civic life today to generate brand new power in even the most unequal situations, the most rigged games, it is entirely possible to generate brand new power out of thin air through the magic act of organizing. Organizing, inviting one other human, 2, 10, 100 other humans to engage in a common endeavor with a common objective where you've got to search out common strategies. And that is the story of the moment we are in right now. People are rediscovering the ultimate infinitude of power in civic life. Well, how did I come to these views? How did I come to realize that this is the nature of power? It's actually quite simple, by living in a city. I worked for many years in Washington, D.C., working in national politics, worked for President Clinton, worked on Capitol Hill, and I came to understand and appreciate all the ways in which Washington, D.C. is this artificial domed realm, domed in many senses. It is a realm in which the logic of zero-sum thinking is predominant. It is a logic of mechanized engagement. It is a logic that says that if someone gains, I must lose. But everything I have come to know about democracy and the truth of citizen power and the infinitude of citizen power, I have learned in my life, not in a machine, but in civic gardens, and in the civic gardens in particular of my town of Seattle. And I've learned it as well in our work at Citizen University and the Aspen Institute, collaborating with civic innovators from cities all across the land. And what I've learned is this: the point of a city is to make citizens. A city is not great if it does not make great citizens. Now, to some of you that may seem non-objectionable and even cliche, but I invite you to actually think about the implications of this. To others of you, what I just said may seem hopelessly naive, maybe even completely wrong. Some of you would say that, no, the point of a city is to concentrate the talent and the networks that fuel economic opportunity and growth. That the point of a city is to make markets. But you know what? That's a description, actually, of a factory or an ecosystem of factory. A city must have a market, it is true, but a market does not actually have to have a city. If you go to Shenzhen, China, you see a marketplace on steroids and spades, a hothouse of combinatorial evolution that allows all kinds of new technological solutions to arise out of thin air instantly. Silicon Valley is the same kind of environment. But neither of these places, when you actually reckon with them, generates the capacity for deep self-government, for hybridized art and imagination, for social responsibility and deep resilience. Neither of these places teaches the people who live there to be part of the answer to a single question that is at the heart of all civic life. Who decides? Who decides? That question is at the very heart of all civic power. And the cities that manage to figure out how to teach their people to be citizens, that is, contributors to community, who are literate in power and participants in questions of common concern, people who write themselves into the story of who decides. Those cities that do this will be the most resilient, the most creative, and yes, by the way, the most prosperous and durably prosperous cities on the planet. One of the basic realities of civic power is this, that once you take stock, take inventory of the kinds of power you have at any fractal scale, individually, in a community, in a room like this, or at a level of a city, once you take inventory of that stock of power, and here in this room we have people power, we have money power, we have ideas power, we have the power to shape social norms, once you take that inventory, you face a very simple binary choice. Shall I hoard or shall I circulate? That's it. And that's as true for us individually, or as the network that showed up at CityLab Paris, or as the residents of our cities. And when you reckon with that binary, shall I hoard or shall you circulate, it is important to remember that circulators win. Circulators thrive. And the problem today is that in cities around the world, cities are actually themselves the cause of hoarding, the source of hoarding. They generate the very problems that we are gathered here to try to solve. They generate the very problems that have given rise to populism and angry anti-establishmentarianism all around the planet. And so even if you hold institutional power in government or philanthropy or business, indeed, especially if you hold such power, It is now in your mutual sense of self-interest to teach power, to disperse power, to circulate it as widely as you possibly can, to build a civic infrastructure that matches all the hard infrastructure we've been talking about the last couple of days, a civic infrastructure of heart, of trust, and affection. And I want to describe briefly now 3 simple ways to do that. The first is simply this: teach power relentlessly. Teach it by doing it. Teach people power in the practice of power. And to teach it across all kinds of lines of race and class and borders. We've heard throughout the last couple of days examples of this kind of teaching of power. Participatory budgeting, a movement that started in Porto Alegre, Brazil, now has spread all over the world. Late to the game in the United States, but all over the world now. In the United States, there's a program in Chicago called the Mikveh Challenge, named after a former judge and member of Congress named Abner Mikveh, who in his retirement decided the best way to teach kids in tough communities in Chicago, to teach them civics, is to have them go do civics. To have them identify, what would you like to change in your bus service? What would you like to change in your water quality? What would you like to change to stop being in a food desert? And then to go change it, to figure out who decides on all those questions and to insert yourselves, even though you're just a middle schooler or a high schooler, into the outcome. There are public libraries all around the United States and all around the world that are working to teach power. In Washington, D.C., libraries teach a class called DC 101. In the Seattle Public Library, as in libraries all around the United States, there are courses on immigrant integration, which aren't just about learning the English language, but are about learning the language of power, learning how to navigate systems and insert yourself into those systems. And when you think about it, we're all immigrants to power. We are all newcomers on the shores of decision-making. Some of us made that moment of migration, had that moment of migration many, many years ago. But others of us are just now landing and realizing, holy cow, I don't get this realm. I don't understand this place. I don't know how to navigate my way around. We are all immigrants to power in this way. Now, teaching power isn't just about courses and workshops. It's also about fostering a culture of participation in which just by showing up, just by being invited to show up, you learn what it means to inhabit your power as a citizen. Our work at Citizen University is very centered around the generation of these kinds of civic, communal, creative rituals. We've got a program called The Joy of Voting, which is about rekindling a culture that used to exist in the United States, really till about the advent of television, a culture of joyful, raucous, creative participation around elections and voting. Street theater, open-air debates, bonfires, battles of bands, dueling parades. That kind of culture can be rekindled at the local level if you invite folks, if you invite artists, musicians, everyday neighbors to come out and play. And by playing, realize how much power they have. This kind of work can't just be for those who are already inclined. The presentations we've heard, I think about Raj Chetty yesterday talking about the determinants of social isolation, the determinants of the ways in which people get cut out of the economic opportunity picture. And one of the most important determinants there, was fourth on his list, but it's first on mine, is social capital. And social capital, when you get down to it, is about being literate in power and understanding how, in networks and communities, you get stuff done with others. So the teaching of power here is fundamental to manufacture this sense of participation and ownership. The second big thing we've got to do right now to circulate power in and around cities is to incubate mutual aid. Now, cities often think about how to incubate entrepreneurs, how to incubate ecosystems of entrepreneurs, how to create leadership networks for people from different sectors, but it is not enough to focus only on the economic dimension, and it's not enough to think only about how to stitch things together in a purely Noah's Ark kind of way, two of every kind. Let's get a couple of folks from this sector, a couple of folks in that sector. What we've got to do is actually foster an environment where there can be experiments of hybridization, mixing networks, not monopolizing connections. One of our other projects at Citizen University is something called the Civic Collaboratory. And what this is a network of civic innovators drawn from all different kinds of sectors. People who work on immigrant rights, veterans, voting, democracy reform, civic education, civic technology. But also people who run the gamut from Tea Party co-founders to Black Lives Matter co-founders, from the left, the right, and points orthogonal to that axis. And all these folks come together not just to network and exchange cards, but to engage in mutual aid. We've devised a format that's really modeled after a practice in immigrant communities of lending circles. We call it the Rotating Credit Club. And every time we gather, which is about every quarter, several people take turns being in rotation and standing at the podium and presenting to the rest of the group a project they're working on, an initiative they're trying to launch in their city or in their sector. And the rest of the group has to offer not just commentary or critique, but to make hard commitments of help, to make investments of capital, social, economic, intellectual, institutional, relationship capital in their comrades' endeavor. Why? Why such generosity? Because what goes around comes around. Because what we're fostering is a spirit of mutual aid. And every one of us now who is a leader in a city, and I'm not just talking about mayors, quite frankly, I'm talking only secondarily about mayors. Everybody in this room, whether you come from the arts or philanthropy or science or the corporate world, has the capacity right now to create your own version of the Civic Collaboratory, this kind of mutual aid society. We're now taking this national network and actually localizing it. We're launching one that will be for the city of Chicago, to bring together in that same cross-sectoral, cross-ideological, cross-domain way, not just to meet each other, but to create together. The third and the final dimension of what it means to teach power is this: listen to the body politic. When you think about protest, what is protest? We live in an age of protest. But what is protest? Protest, properly understood, is the immune system of the body politic, saying, I'm sick. We are sick. So, by the way, are long silences of cynicism. These too are signals from the immune system of the body politic, saying that the legitimacy of our institutions, people's faith that government is there actually to serve them, people's sense that there is going to be some remedy that emerges for the isolation, atomization, and radicalization of our times. Protest is one measure of that immune system kicking into gear. And so in St. Louis and Ferguson, protests about police violence aren't just about policing or the criminal justice system, but they are about long patterns of exclusion from opportunity and from the grid of life in the city. Protests about Confederate monuments in the United States. We had a wonderful session this morning about memory and monuments. But protests about monuments are not just protests about monuments. They are a plea to be included in the story of us. And what is a polity but a place that comes up with a story of us? And if that story is leaving out large numbers of people who can't see themselves as us, the immune system is going to tell you. And so to listen to the body doesn't just mean to legitimize and bow to protesters. Protesters aren't always right. Their causes aren't always practical. But what it does mean is to invite everybody who has a beef, enough of a beef to want to take it to the streets, to invite them to the table, to invite them to the room where it happens, to invite fast food workers, to invite domestic workers, to invite immigrants, documented and not, to invite folks to say, how can you be part of the circle of decision? I can't promise you you're going to get everything you want, but how can you not feel like you're cut out altogether? And then to put upon them both the opportunity and the obligation to come up with solutions, to solve and not only to complain. When you do these three things, teach power relentlessly, foster mutual aid, and listen to the aches of the body politic, you boost circulation of power in untold ways. And when you do not, when you ignore these signals, you get the situation that too many cities around the planet are in right now, in which they are becoming, like my own hometown of Seattle, fortresses of compounding privilege, of self-reinforcing opportunity for a smaller and smaller us relative to everyone outside those walls. And yet, even within that fortress of privilege, let me tell you, as a longtime Seattleite, even within those walls, people still remain consumed with insecurity and scarcity thinking, with fear. So our job now, given today's dysfunction in national capitals and international bodies, our job is to make sure that cities are, in fact, the laboratories of democracy that we've been saying they can be. Not in isolation, but as Mayor Bloomberg said at the outset, in networks of innovation. And let's together make an archipelago of power where people who live in our cities, where we and our neighbors are not just spectators, but are players in the game of decision-making. Not just consumers, but producers of the culture. And not just clients, but citizens. Thank you very much.